The TP-Link Archer AX3200 was released as a response to the Asus RT AX86U, which proudly flaunted its multi-gigabit port and the new Wi-Fi 6 features. And yes, the TP-Link router does also offer a 2.5 gigabit port, but unlike the RT AX86U, it cannot be used alongside the secondary WAN or LAN gigabit port for dual WAN purposes. Furthermore, to keep the price tag more competitive, TP-Link did add just 3 other Ethernet ports and a single USB 3.0 port. The secondary one is USB 2.0. You do get an abundance of antennas, and this is actually a tri-band router, but the physical rates aren't that great, so there's pretty much no chance of going above the 1 gigabit limit, and that's despite the multi-gigabit port. TP-Link does say that the Archer AX3200 supports OFDMA and MU-MIMO, and there's also support for the WPA3 encryption. I saw that the channel bandwidth of one 5 GHz radio band could go up to 80 MHz, and for whatever reason, TP-Link said that the second 5 GHz radio supports the 160 MHz channel bandwidth, but after checking out the software it doesn't seem to go above 80 MHz. This should be corrected since it could lead to confusion. Then again, not many people actually need a tri-band router unless they want to use one mesh and connect additional TP-Link routers to form a single larger network. The TP-Link Archer AX3200 is actually the first Wi-Fi 6 router from the series to go for this more aggressive look, which was then recycled by the AX90 and even the newer Wi-Fi 6E AXE95. There are lots of lines at the top of the case, and an elevated division in the middle that ends up with a single LED on the front. TP-Link had so much space to add a proper LED array, but no, let's keep it minimal, while also adding 6 fixed antennas all around the case and putting various lines and ridges pretty much everywhere. Very minimal. It's worth mentioning that the Archer AX3200 has 2 mounting holes at the bottom to let you mount the router on the wall. Now let's check out the ports. Besides the USB 3.0 port from the left side of the device, everything else can be found on the rear side. And from the left, there's the USB 2.0 port, followed by the power port and the power button. Next, we can see the reset button and the 2 WAN ports, one 2.5 gigabit and the second is Ethernet gigabit. Farther to the right, there are 3 Ethernet LAN ports, all gigabit. I did like that TP-Link has added a lot of ventilation cutouts and holes, but I did use the thermal camera to see just how well the router manages to keep a decent temperature. And as you can see, it performed quite well. The chipsets seem to be efficient and the heatsinks have no trouble moving the heat, so no chance of overheating. I always first make a separate video of the routers that I intend to test just for the teardown, and I did the same thing with the TP-Link AX3200, so you can check the dedicated video if you like. I have also included the highlights from that video here, so these are the main components. Now let's also see a harder comparison with other routers from the same category as the TP-Link AX3200. The TP-Link Archer AX3200 does come with the main Wi-Fi 6 features, such as OFDMA and TWT. Even OFDMA will be of use only in truly crowded environments, and if the client devices are compatible, and right now there is still some lack in compatibility with the features of Wi-Fi routers, such as MU-MIMO. I noticed that TP-Link did not mention whether the OFDMA is available on all 3 radio bands, so I checked the interface. There is the option to enable OFDMA globally, but no mention on how it is implemented. I think it's only on the better 5 GHz radio, but I don't have the equipment to confirm it. I also noticed that MU-MIMO could be enabled only on the secondary 5 GHz radio, so there are clearly some limitations in place, most likely to keep the cost low. I did see that there was support for one mesh, which is the equivalent to the AI mesh from Asus, and considering the 3 radio bands, one could be used for backhaul traffic, so you could get a better throughput at the secondary mesh node. Another thing that I saw when setting up the SSIDs was that the first 5 GHz network uses different channels than the secondary 5 GHz network. And it makes sense considering that we don't want any overlapping between the two of them. If you didn't check the other router and access points reviews, note that I decided to use the tools developed by Mr. Jim Salter, which are NetBurn and NetHydra, for simultaneous simulation of various types of traffic. So I powered on the TP-Link AX3200, hooked up the server machine via an Ethernet connection, and prepared the 5 client devices. And the reason why I thought this was a good idea was because the single client tests, while useful to get a general idea about what you should expect from the wireless router, they don't really paint an accurate picture about how the device will behave in your home. I have already added the signal strength attenuation into the reviews, which is better than just the amount of feet between the client and the router, but seeing how the wireless router handles multiple types of traffic at the same time across a variety of client devices should give you a better idea on whether it's suitable for your home or office. These are the client devices that will be used for these tests. The types of traffic that I'm currently simulating are 4K and 1080p streaming, web browsing, voice over IP, and downloading. As for the server device, these are its specifications. It's worth mentioning that the client devices will connect to a single 5 GHz network at 80 MHz channel bandwidth and OFDMA enabled, and know that the advantage that the TP-Link AX3200 has over other Wi-Fi 6 routers is the extra 5 GHz network, which can help lower the load. I first ran the 1080p streaming test on all client devices at the same time, and I ran it multiple times and made an average of all the results I got. I'm not entirely sure which limit will be the best for the user, but obviously the lower the latency the better. So ideally, I think it should be below 30 milliseconds, or at least below 50 milliseconds. Only the Wi-Fi 6E client stayed close to this limit for 75% of the time, and it did raise gradually, but it's still the best performer from the bunch. The two Wi-Fi 6E laptops were higher by about 10 milliseconds across the board, and I suppose it's not surprising that the Wi-Fi 5 clients had a tougher time, going above 100 milliseconds for at least 5% of the time. This means that the user will experience some buffering, but it shouldn't be too severe. I did set the throughput limit on all client devices to be 5 megabits per second, and as you can see from the graph, all devices managed to reach it, which is excellent. But what about 4K streaming? It's of course more demanding than 1080p streaming, and I did set the limit to 25 megabits per second. And things were a bit different this time. Again, the ideal latency should not go above 30 or at least 50 milliseconds, and pretty much all clients went past 100 milliseconds from the beginning. The Wi-Fi 6E PC even rose close to 500 milliseconds 1% of the time, so it could not offer any streaming experience at all. But this is why we have two 5 GHz radios available, because as you will see a bit lower, 2 or 3 very intense and demanding clients can be handled per band, even including downloading. Kind of. I was also curious to see if all clients managed to reach the 25 megabits per second limit. We can see that not all did, which is a bit of a problem, and it may force you to go with a lower resolution in case you want to stream Netflix at max quality on 5 client devices at the same time. Then again, as I said before, you always have a spare 5 GHz band, so hop onto it to make no compromises. Following the TP-Link AX3200 simultaneous 1080p streaming tests, I decided to add some web browsing into the mix as well. And I'm not talking about opening a page, wait 3 minutes and then open another. No, we're going turbo mode. Certainly, I added 500 milliseconds of jitter to randomize the process a bit and simulate some real-life conditions. Additionally, I set NetBurn to load 12 concurrent instances of 128 kilobytes, which means roughly 1.5 megabytes. This is the size of some lighter web pages, and since there are 12 separate pieces, it simulates multiple types of content loaded on a page. It can be pictures, text, tables, and so on. The graph illustrates the 1080p streaming performance while the fast browsing is happening in the background. As you can see, the MacBook Pro is the only device that goes above 100 milliseconds for the entire duration of the test, while one of the two Lenovo laptops performed surprisingly well. Even the Wi-Fi 6E client showed reasonable levels for about 75% of the time. What about the intense web browsing? For the turbo mode web browsing test, I think that a maximum of 1.5 seconds is tolerable, after which the user will need to reload the page. And, as you can see from the image, all client devices managed to remain underneath this set limit, which is excellent news once again. As an early conclusion, the TP-Link AX3200 seems to handle decently well the 1080p stress tests, although I would still spread the clients between the two 5 GHz networks just to get a perfect performance. The 4K streaming test alone put a bit of strain on the TP-Link AX3200, so let's see what happens after adding web browsing alongside it as well. We can see that only one client device stayed beneath 100 milliseconds for almost the entire duration of the test, and it's a Wi-Fi 6E client device. The Zima board and the MacBook Pro kept a somewhat lower profile, although still above 100 milliseconds. And the Wi-Fi 6E client refused to cooperate entirely, and so did the second Wi-Fi 6E client device. But before reaching a conclusion, let's see the web browsing graph. It seems that the Wi-Fi 6E client refused to cooperate here as well, and the second Wi-Fi 6E Lenovo laptop also had a fit, getting very close to the set limit. It still remained beneath it, barely. The other client devices had no trouble offering a good browsing experience. But were the client devices able to reach the set 25 megabits per second throughput? The answer is no. So again, as with the 4K streaming only tests, you will have to make some compromises in resolution. And if you add the browsing into the mix, things get even more difficult for the TP-Link AX3200. In the early reviews, I usually stopped here, but I was convinced to go even further and include downloading tests as well. And it's the type that has the freedom to utilize as much bandwidth as it likes. That being said, I relied on a couple of clients to download 10 megabytes files continuously at whatever rate they wanted, while two clients tried to stream 4K videos, this time kept at 35 megabits per second, and one was browsing intensively. The two clients handling the downloads experienced severe latencies, and one 4K streaming client pretty much gave up on his task. The second 4K streaming client went above 1 second, even if not much above it, but it's still an unusable latency for this task. Lastly, we can see that at least the intense browsing experience was within the usable limits, even though it got above 1 second for 5% of the time. Also, I saw that the downloading clients drew an average of 208.5 megabits per second and 297.5 megabits per second respectively, amounting to 516 megabits per second, fairly close to the max Wi-Fi bandwidth. Moving forward, I went a bit lighter on the router and used only a single client device for the simulated downloading traffic, leaving two clients for the simultaneous 4K streaming at 35 megabits per second and other two for the intense browsing. One 4K streaming client really tried, but still quickly rose above 150 milliseconds for pretty much all of the duration of the test. The other one didn't bother and shot high, reaching close to 1 second for 1% of the time and above 500 milliseconds for the rest. As for the browsing clients, we can see that both stayed below 1 second up until that 1% of the time when one rose close to 1.5 seconds, while the other managed to accomplish 5 seconds. That's not good. As for the average throughput of the downloading client, it was 478.3 megabits per second. Next, I went even more gentle on the AX3200 and used only 3 clients, one for downloading the same 10 megabytes file again and again, one for 4K streaming at 35 megabits per second, and one for intense browsing. The 4K streaming client was more reasonable than before, but it still went above acceptable levels, unless you don't mind a lot of buffering. Then there's the intense browsing, which I suppose stayed below unreasonable limits, and lastly we get the downloading client, which showed latencies between 200 and 300 milliseconds for 95% of the time. Is that better than before? It's definitely better than on the other tests, and I suppose usable depending on your workflow. Moving forward, I decided to continue to use 3 clients, but one for downloading 1 MB files continuously, one for intense browsing and the last for voice over IP. The downloading client didn't play nice with the others and shot above 1 second for the entire duration of the test. The intense browsing test passed, but what about the voice over IP? Depending on some publications on the web, we should be happy with anything below 150 milliseconds, but again I prefer it to be as close to 0 as possible. The client managed to stay below 50 milliseconds most of the time, and it only rose above 100 milliseconds for 1% of the time. The throughput for the downloading client was, on average, 625.1 megabits per second. As for the last multi-client test is to let all clients download 10 megabytes files at whichever rate they see fit. And hopefully no client disconnects and the network doesn't collapse. I don't really need to interpret much here. All went on an Apollo mission to the moon and the average total throughput was 393.8 megabits per second, which honestly is lower than expected. Now that the multi-client tests are done, I also ran some iPerf3 single-client tests. I used 3 client devices, one Wi-Fi 6 and 2 Wi-Fi 5. The channel bandwidth was set to the maximum of 80 MHz, and since there is a 2.5 gigabit port, I used it to connect the server device, ensuring that there are no bottlenecks, while also keeping the interference to the minimum. You can see that one 5 GHz radio performs better than the other one across the board, and as always, I had to also take the signal attenuation into account. Otherwise, how exactly are you going to reproduce these results in your own home? Trust me, the distance-based values hold less meaning outside my own home. I have also added a long-term wireless test, including a quick comparison with the TP-Link Archer AX73. And as expected, there is also a comparison table with other Wi-Fi 6 routers. As for the 2.4 GHz single-client wireless tests, I used the same 3 client devices and the overall performance was decent, offering a very nice Wi-Fi coverage. I included the signal attenuation graph as well and a brief comparison with other wireless routers. The TP-Link Archer AX3200 does have 2 USB ports, but since the USB 2.0 is suitable for printers, my main focus was towards the USB 3.0 port. And to test the storage performance, I used the Western Digital My Passport external SSD and moved back and forth a 3GB multimedia folder. This way, I saw that the writing speed was 47 megabytes per second, while the reading speed was 50 megabytes per second. I also ran a LAN-to-LAN test, which unfortunately was capped by the 1 gigabit ports. Upstream I measured an average of 947 megabits per second, while downstream I saw 929 megabits per second, which is a good result. I had to check the average power consumption of the AX3200, and to do so I connected the router to a smart relay. After I opened the Relays app, I could see the power consumption. While some manufacturers struggle to find a balanced installation process, TP-Link lets you choose between using an app or to go the web-based software route. And I'm sure most people will prefer the app, so I used it as well. The layout is designed to cater to the people that care only for a more superficial configuration of the router, while anything more in-depth is left for the web-based interface. The network window will give you quick access to the Wi-Fi settings, to the guest network, will show the status of the internet connection and the number of client devices. The client section will let you see a list of the connected devices, and it is possible to block the access to the internet, but I also saw that you can add them to a parental control profile. I created a new profile just to see what options were available, and you can manually add websites or domains to the whitelist or blocklist. You can set scheduled access as well as time limits for the client devices. You can also set the clients to the highest priority, which is some very basic quality of service, and under the More main section we can find some additional options. You should be able to change the operation mode between router and access point, control the LEDs, enable one mesh, update the firmware, and I also noticed that there are some advanced settings available. Don't get your hopes up because it's just the IPTV VLAN options. If you need anything more from the app, such as an IPS, more detailed statistics, especially for the parental control, an antivirus and other protection systems, then you will have to opt in for the subscription-based Home Shield package. As for the web-based interface, we see that the network map shows very similar data as the network section from the app. The internet and the wireless sections are also very basic, so the advanced section is the area of interest. The first set of settings relates to the network, which includes the internet setup, but it's also possible to set up the secondary connection, although it's still a shame that I did not see any load balancing or dual WAN settings available. The wireless settings are also far more complex than on the app, although they're still a bit below the professional tab from the Asus routers. The QoS and the parental controls are not that much better than on the app, so there's very limited actual control, but hey, don't worry, TeamP-Link got you covered. As long as you're willing to pay for a subscription, then the Home Shield app does give you a slightly enhanced parental control, as well as real-time IoT and network protection. The TP-Link Archer AX3200 also offers some security features, such as the stateful inspection firewall, access control, and there's also some VPN support. Just like Asus, I suppose TP-Link wanted to be cool, so it added Alexa support, which is a privacy nightmare. But then again, I guess you can vocally tell it to restart the router or whatever. The TP-Link Archer AX3200 seems to be one of those hidden gems that not many talk about, and after getting it, it seems that there are many layers and dimensions to it. But not all is perfect. Sure, the wireless performance using Wi-Fi 6 client devices was great, the software does cover the basics, and the parental controls are better than before. But to get the advanced security options which are standard on Asus routers, then you will have to use the subscription-based Home Shield. I would have liked to see some third-party operating system being supported to open up the true potential of the AX3200, but for now it's only up to TP-Link to do so. So should you give the Archer AX3200 a chance? I have mentioned the RT AX86U as a competitor, but they're actually nowhere near the same price range, so they don't really compete with each other. Also, considering that it's no longer Costco exclusive and it does offer a decent wireless performance, then yes, the AX3200 is worth checking out. That's about it for today, thank you for watching and see you next time.